And good evening from Philadelphia. Frank here with another episode of UFO News Network Sunday. Tonight on Tuesday night. And let me bring in my co host, Chant Hanna, to introduce our special guest for this evening. Hi, Chant.
Hi, Frank. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. We have a very special guest tonight. He has been on many specials all around the world on mainstream media, and he's also been involved in the topic of ufology for many decades. And his name is Edwin Gatia, and he's a native of Bacolod City, Philippines, and he has a Bachelor of Arts degree in mathematics, a master's degree in tourism. He's currently a senior member of the Royal Institute of Singapore Tourism. He's a former member of the American Meteor Society, International Meteor Organization, Philippine Astronomical Society Life member, Philippine Association for the Advancement of Science, one of 6 amateur astronomers from the Philippines recommended for the Parks Interpretation Program of the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution, became a volunteer field investigator for CUFOs in the early 80s, wrote and published the book Unknown and Unearthly, the Philippine UFO Experience, done by Lulu Publishing in 2009, with Filipino amateur astronomer Christopher Go, who discovered Red Spot Jr. on the surface of Jupiter 2011. He initiated the holding of the first Philippine UFO conference in Manila in 2010, and he has traveled and visited 24 countries to date. Some countries he's been to multiple times. Welcome, Edwin, to our show. How are you?
Hello, Hannah. Yes, thank you. I'm fine.
Great. It's so lovely having you here on the show. Wanted to ask you a question. How long have you been involved exactly in the topic of ufology?
Well, I've been involved with that since I became an investigator for the Center for UFO Studies back in 1980. And I was there for about, I was doing research and actual field investigations of sighting cases from then on until about 1987.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that. I wanted to go back to before that period of time. When you were growing up in the Bacolod city of Philippines, and you'll have to pronounce that city for us because I think I'm mispronouncing it. Please correct me on that. I wanted to know, when you were growing up, did you have any unusual sightings of UFO activity, in the skies or over the seas?
A personal experience, are you asking about?
Yes.
Sometimes back in the early 90s, we were constructing the dome of my personal observatory up on the roof of my house. And it was about 2 in the afternoon. And there was this very bright light, which I thought was something unusual because it was as bright as the planet Venus at its brightest. But it was in the wrong place. It was on the other side of the sun. It was in the eastern sky. And this thing was quite like, it reminded me of a case which I also investigated where they saw a very bright light and it appeared to be a spherical object. But the one that I saw, it was unexpected. And I ran down to get a pair of binoculars to take a closer look. And when I got back, it was gone. And at first I thought it must have probably have been an aircraft that reflected sunlight because the sun was on the other side. But it didn't really look like aircrafts. I'm used to watching aircrafts flying over my area, and that one was quite different.
Thank you. Yeah.
It looked exactly like as bright as Venus at its brightest.
Thank you for letting us know about that. There's so much I want to ask you about, but I'd like to go ahead and start off first with why you decided to become an investigator for CUFOs, and tell us a little bit about why you would do something like that.
Well, it all started in 1979 when there was a wave of UFO sightings all over the Philippines, and it was probably the first time that there was this numerous reports coming from the different parts of the country. But it was not until about a year later that a journalist by the name of Robert Pratt flew over to the Philippines to do investigations on those sightings in '79. And a journalist friend of mine, a local one for the national papers, who was a columnist in the national paper, asked me if I wanted to meet the guy who he said is doing investigations on UFOs. And I said, yeah. And so I was introduced to Mr. Pratt, and it all started when he left me with a manual. It was actually a MUFON manual for field investigators. And so what I did was to make a follow-up on the many witnesses to the 1979 events. And this led me from one witness to another. And with the use of the manual, I was able to gather and gain experience on how to investigate those cases. And those reports were duly sent over to the Center for UFO Studies. Well, at least that's where the reports went. I joined CUFOs because when Mr. Pratt returned to the U.S., apparently he had a talk with the late Dr. Alan J. Hynek, who founded CUFOS, and Dr. Hynek himself sent me a short letter inviting me to join the organization as a field investigator, which greatly encouraged me to do so. And I took the MUFON field investigators examination, which I passed, and that was when I became officially an investigator on behalf of the organization. And that's when I started looking for the witnesses in the 1979 events. And eventually, that's how I started my adventure in field investigations.
Great. Thank you very much for filling us in on that. That's a fascinating history you just shared. You and I talked earlier today about how one would interview witnesses regarding possible UFO sightings. And you were sharing with me how you had to do things old school style. Can you please explain what that means?
Well, you see, back in those days, we didn't have gadgets. And, well, we had telephone then at the time, but the witnesses were from the countrysides where they didn't have phone lines. In some instances, it was easier because some of those witnesses were confined in a small town or a small village, or they worked in one company, and so I could easily trace them. But other than that, it was a little bit difficult looking for them. But I did manage anyway, and when I got hold of one, well, I started interviewing. They started filling out the forms, and all of those reports I sent to the Center for UFO Studies then.
Great. And wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you would do an interview with folks about a possible UFO sighting when you see them in person and they're telling you about their sighting. Can you tell us a little bit about what you might look at in your observations of that person? Things like body language, tone of voice. What do you look for when you are listening to them talk about their sighting?
Well, the very first person that I wanted to do an interview with regarding her sighting, I was informed that a certain lady, a businesswoman, had a sighting experience. And so I called her up and I said that if I could come over and talk to her about it. of course, she was kind of like, what's that all about? Or, something like that. And I said, I'm doing research for the Center for UFO Studies. And I understand that I was told that you were one of those who had a possible sighting. And so I had the appointment made, and we met because she was at first a little bit apprehensive as to what was that all about. And I said, it's just I want to get some idea of what you've seen, of what you experienced, and all that. And sometimes depends on depending on how you like introduce yourself. Uh, and since I was always speaking in English, it makes a bit of a difference. And I had my first interview with that businesswoman, and one of the first statements that she gave was that it was the most unusual thing she had ever seen in her life. And I've heard that kind of statements from most of the other witnesses that I have talked to. And the way that they talk, the way the body moves, the gestures and everything, the eyes, and the tonal voice, they all tell you that they have seen something very unusual.
Okay,
Now, really quick, were the witnesses seeing the same type of thing, or were they seeing different types of UFOs? What was some of the details of what they saw?
Well, she was just saying that it was something like a bright thing that was floating in the sky. But what got me was when she said that she had a feeling that when she looked out the window to see if the thing was still there, she had that feeling of being watched, or that the thing was actually like looking at her too. And at the time, she said she was a little scared because she was on the way. And, since it was her first experience of that something that's pretty unusual, she kind of got a little scared about it. She tried to go back to, it all started when her husband wanted to go out and do his early morning jogging around the community. And when she pointed the thing to her husband, the husband said, now that's just probably a comet. Of course, which was not. There was no comet at the time that appeared in the sky. And that was when she felt a little strange about the thing. So she hurriedly went up their apartment and looked out of the window to see if the thing was still floating. And she said she had that eerie feeling that she was also being looked at by the thing. And that kind of got me. And the way she would, when she speaks, she was very emotional about it.
And was that a fairly typical account from this particular 79 wave? Or did you get, something of a variety of reactions? Or how did... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yes, that was very typical of all of the witnesses that I talked to. There was some variation depending on the object that was seen, that was observed. One described it as like a Christmas tree that landed in the middle of the road while he was driving a big truck down from the mountains back to the mill, the sugar mill. And of course, the witness was kind of like shocked to see. He described it as a Christmas tree that landed right in the middle of the road.
Okay. Yeah, that would certainly get my attention, especially if I was at work and all that,
Edwin, I was going to ask you, why do you think there was a wave of UFO sightings during that period of time? Do you have a hypothesis or any kind of theories you want to share with us regarding that period of time, as far as why there could have been a wave of sightings of UFO activity?
I have no particular theory about that. Waves do happen. Historically, we have seen that waves of sighting have happened in some other countries, in the West, for
We've
instance.
had them here, absolutely, of course.
Yes. So the Philippines is not is probably the same. I mean, the UFO phenomenon is a global phenomenon, and uh, such a wave happening over in the Philippines is probably not unusual, except that it just happened at that particular date and time.
And were these
Okay.
concentrated onto like a particular day, or was it basically like a couple of weeks, or a month, or a couple months? What was the time frame for things
The
picking
time
up, and then
frame, it went on for because the reports were coming in from different parts of the country.
right?
The first report actually came out from where I was living at the time in the island of Negros, and apparently that started it. And after that, I could see in the newspapers reports of sightings coming from north, south, and all parts of the country. The time frame is all in 1979.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, and
Thank you.
what kind of frequency were we talking about? Like maybe 100 a month as compared to a usual of maybe like 5 or 10, or what kind of numbers were we talking about in terms of number of sightings?
Well, in terms of the numbers of sightings, we get one sighting from this particular part of the country, and then a week after, there would be another one from another part of the country. And the frequency and the number, the volume of sightings just came in one by one. I mean, something like there's one scene right now, a few weeks after, another one seen from another part of the country,
Okay.
another one from another part of the country, and all that. And I collated all of those reports later on, and that's how I actually tried to trace back the witnesses.
Got it. And
Okay.
were you like reading the newspapers? Is that how you were finding these people, or were they finding you through word of mouth? How did you track them down?
Um, I would read the papers, try to find where the sighting had taken place, and try to get in touch with the local authorities. And if they confirm that there are witnesses, then I would go there.
Okay.
That
So when
was
you say
what
when you say local authorities, what do you mean? Like the police?
yes, like the police or the mayor or some of
Okay.
the
Okay.
town officials. Because
That's
those reports
fascinating.
also get to them anyway, and they get to know about that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for having filled us in on that. And then I have a question. It's kind of similar to a question I asked you earlier, but I wanted to know what is one of the most interesting UFO case or cases you have worked on, researched, witnessed, or heard of more specifically?
I would say one of the best cases I had was a landing incident, a couple of landing incidents actually. One which involved intent entities, another one which involved school children, and the one which involved school children was a multiple witness event, and it happened in broad daylight. And what was interesting about that case was when the object landed, it left imprints. Uh, a close encounter of the second kind, you might say.
Right. Right. And those types of cases are pretty interesting. There's a famous one in South Africa, the Ariel School, and then there's a Westfall School case in Australia. And those are pretty interesting cases, and a few of them do pop up around the world. Tell us a little bit more about that case. I mean, did you talk to the kids? What was their reaction, if you did?
That event transpired in 1984, but it was not until 1987 Yes, I think it was 87 that I was actually able to visit the place because it's not a little far from here, and I have to fly over there and all that. But incidentally, I was a bit lucky because at the time I was invited by a university to do a series of lectures on astronomy for the local science teachers. And this university was in the city where only an hour away was the site of that landing incident. So after the training, one of the physics professors took me over there, accompanied me to the site where I had to meet. Well, the children by that time were already in high school because during the event, when they witnessed that landing incident, they were still in the grade school. There were three of them, and I was able to get hold of two of those three kids, and I got a first-hand account from straight from them as to what they experienced.
And you said that they saw individuals. Could you describe them?
Um, as in the case of the landing case, the three children were told to get water from a nearby creek near the school to water the plants. And as they did so, they saw this thing landing in the open rice field, um, not too far away. And of course, that kind of amazed them for that matter. And they described the thing as after it landed, it opened a kind of a door or a porthole where there was a bright light coming out. But there were no entities because I was asking if they saw anything moving or if they seen uh, people or and they said no. It was just an open thing. It opened up and they can see some bright light inside. And as they were watching, the thing after about 20 minutes took off. Now the whole school heard the sound after the thing had taken off, but they have not seen the thing themselves except for those three children.
Do you know, was that area determined to have radiation at all? Was there any radiation detection equipment used at all?
No, none. I believe none. But what they did was, after the thing took off, they called for a local photographer to take pictures of the imprints that the thing left on the soil, on the where it landed. It left imprints, and the local photographer was able to take photos of those imprints.
Okay.
I met the photographer himself.
And so did you go over his film very carefully with him? How did that work out?
I was able to get hold of the prints from the film. He had the negative, the original negatives, because he made several photos of those from that film, and the photos were distributed around.
Were they good photos, Edwin, that he took? Were they good photos? Did he take good, clear photos?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And were those shown in mainstream media? Was this covered at all in mainstream media, this story?
This story came out in the local papers. It also came out in the national paper. Yes, it was covered. Apparently, somebody got hold of the story and wrote it out over on a national newspaper.
Okay.
And I got hold of I was able to get hold of the copy of that newspaper, which actually also gave information as to where to go and who to talk to and all that. So most of the information that I got prior to talking to the witnesses were from the papers themselves.
Okay. And then I was going to ask you about the other case that you mentioned that you felt was interesting to you. You said there were two cases or a few cases.
Yes.
What was the other one?
Now, the other one involved entities, and that was very interesting because the witness himself was he was interviewed by Mr. Pratt of National Enquirer. He was also investigated by the local military. Now, I have to remember that in 1979, the Philippines was still under martial law, and it was a military takeover, and nobody would want to fool around with military people. And so telling stories about things landing and seeing people walking would be something that you have to be very careful with. And so, as he narrated to me, it was early morning that he got up and started the day because his occupation was to sell like ice cream. You know, he was an ice cream man, and he sells his ice cream in a local school. So he would wake up very early in the morning to start the day off, and at that time, about 4:30 in the morning, he saw there were lights that was going through his house because the house is not solid concrete, or the walls have holes in them, and you can actually see bright lights outside. And he saw this bright light moving and went out to investigate. And whereupon he was amazed to see he saw three discs that were hovering, coming down slowly for a landing. He described the shape of the object as something like an inverted, it's like a cooking, where you cook something.
Wait, a fry pan, like? Is that what you mean? A frying pan?
Like a frying pan, yeah, that's
okay,
right. Yes.
Okay.
A large frying pan bulging on one side, and it came down and landed near the riverbank. And he got frightened about it because it was the first time that he saw something like that. And so what he did was to hide alongside the road. There was this drainage, and he got himself curled up in there all the time watching what the thing was doing, and it landed. And after landing, each of the three objects opened up, and there came out an entity, which he at first thought, he said they were probably Russians because they were big and tall. And that's how he described them. And he even described about them having something like wearing a helmet as astronauts would. And I said, how did you determine? Because he said when they moved their heads, the light from a nearby illuminating source would reflect on the helmet, and it would suggest that it had kind of a glass cover, something like motorcycle riders would use. To protect the head, from injury during an accident. So he described them to be having some kind of helmets, wearing helmets and all that. And he said that one thing that caught his attention was that they had what he described as Tommy gun. Well, a Tommy gun is actually a Thompson submachine gun used during World War II. And he said each of them had that with a string around their shoulder. So that's how he described them. He hid himself, so he was never able to interact with those things, because I'm sure I'd be pretty terrified myself if I was in his place.
Edwin, that sounds like a bad science fiction movie from the 1960s.
Yeah, but we have to remember that these folks out in the mountains seldom watch movies like those. I
Right.
mean, they don't even read UFO magazines for that matter because there ain't any.
And see, I'm really glad that you said that because it's very important for our listeners to understand that the folks who are relating some of these UFO sighting and entity and ET, possible ET civilization tales to you that they have witnessed have not been exposed to mainstream media or programming like that. And so for them to describe it is really astounding. What I was going to ask you is, did you believe him?
Yes, and I believed in what he said because I checked his background in the community, and he was the village chief, and everybody believed in his story, knowing that he's a solid person, and he told the military about the same thing, and of course you don't. As I said earlier, you don't fool around with the military during that time.
Okay, and the last question I have about that is, do you feel like the military took his testimonial on that sighting? Do you think they took it seriously?
I think he was taken seriously because of his reputation as a solid person, and you just don't make up stories with the military because they're gonna beat you up. I mean, that's how it is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
during that time, you have to be very careful when the military deals with you. And the provincial commander himself was the one who actually had him taken to the headquarters for well, it was probably more like an interrogation than a field investigator's way of dealing with stories like that.
Do you
Now,
feel
let me jump in here real quick, Chant. Do you have you seen or have you experienced in your investigations? Have you gotten cooperation from the military and civilian, let's say like radar and things like that for the aircraft? Have you gotten a lot in the way of cooperation from those types of folks in your investigations over there?
Yes, I did get the full cooperation of the Philippine Air Force because they had the files of the various sighting cases, and at the time, the one in charge was a colonel, and he sent me the files with a note that said that in the interest of science and his trust in what I told him, that it was for research purposes, and so he handed me a copy of the files. Now, the files contained the various sighting cases that were reported to the military and were also gathered by the Air Force.
Anything turn up that was interesting in the?
Didn't get any. Yes, Frank. Yeah.
Yeah, well, anything in particular that was of interest in those files? Any kind of analysis or anything like that that you thought was important?
No, I think those were just a compilation of what witnesses provided.
Okay.
So it also provided the names of the witnesses, the places where the events transpired, and actually. Witnesses.
Okay. All right, go ahead, Chant.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But where I did
Go ahead.
not get, but where I did not get a very good response was from the U.S. Air Force Base in the north of the country.
Okay, yep,
Clark
yep.
Air Base. And I just got a letter telling me what their usual response would be for inquiries, because I wrote them a formal letter to that effect, requesting for any sighting cases that they have on file, well, but which they said they didn't have.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask you about an interesting topic. First, I'd like to read the definition of a word that I'm going to use before I ask you my question. The word is paranormal. And the definition to paranormal is denoting events or phenomena such as telekinesis or clairvoyance, for example, that are beyond the scope of normal scientific understanding. What I was going to ask you, Edwin, is have you come across any witnesses that have told you that they feel like they have had some kind of telepathic communication happening between themselves and a UFO or ET related craft or ET civilizations? Have you taken down testimony like that?
And none that I've ever experienced, Chant. I know of a lot of friends telling stories about their experiences in haunted houses and some of those paranormal activities, but they were not in any way connected with any UFO activity.
Right, yes. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand that MUFON investigators, CUFOs investigators, and many other types of UFO-related investigators do discern a big difference, or maybe not a big difference, but a difference. There's definitely a difference between the paranormal and the UFO phenomenon and other phenomena. And so just because you see a UFO in the sky doesn't mean that you are having or that you're witnessing a paranormal event. Is that right?
Yes, I agree with that, because I in particular, I do not consider the UFO phenomenon as a true paranormal. The UFO phenomenon is definitely a different thing on its. But I do not
Right.
consider it as a paranormal activity.
Yeah.
Separate from activities like hauntings, telekinesis, telepathy.
Yeah.
Telepathy. I would want to separate the UFO phenomenon from that.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. But I would like to point out one thing. That is, in the case of Betty and Barney Hill, which you know that case so well, Barney Hill did say that ETs were communicating to him psychically. And so there are some iconic cases out there in the world of ufology regarding that topic. But that does not mean that UFO investigators believe the UFO phenomenon falls under the paranormal. So I just would like to share that idea and concept with our listeners. Do you agree with that, Edwin?
Yes, I do agree with that.
Okay. And then I wanted to ask you something else that is considered paranormal to some, but not necessarily fall under the paranormal category. And that is the topic of orbs. MUFON, as you know, that organization so well, they do actually evaluate and investigate certain kinds of orb activity. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think a UFO investigator would want to consider investigating orbs?
I have personally, I have never encountered any orb sighting cases here. So I am not actually really well familiar with that particular phenomenon. I do know that orbs exist, as they have been seen, they have been observed, but not that I know of among witnesses from this country.
I think
Okay.
that's I think that's really interesting because MUFON does look at them, and the reason being is they've gotten so many cases, so many reports of them, so they kind of had to get into that business. And it's
Apparently, well, one case I've seen is I think the orbs having having some kind of a relation with the appearances of crop circles, for instance, like one which I saw where an orb was seen after a crop circle was discovered. I guess that's the only way, any connection that I could think of.
got it.
Yeah. There's also, and we'll move on to another topic, but there's also witnesses that MUFON have come across that will say things like, well, I saw an orb in the sky. And they use that word to describe, the UFO-like activity that they witness. Is that anything that you've come across too, where people will say, well, it looked like an orb? Has that ever happened to you?
No, not that I know of.
Okay, great. Wanted to move on to another topic and ask you, do you think society has evolved to the point where it feels there is extraterrestrial activity and they're more willing to acknowledge the possibility of it? I mean all around the world. Do you think that society has gotten to the point where there is possible extraterrestrial activity, meaning ET civilization or civilizations coming back and forth to our planet? And do you think society is ready for that, to acknowledge that possibility, if that is one?
Personally, I do think so, yes.
Why is that?
Um, to me, it's because the UFO phenomenon is well known around. It's actually a kind of like a household word, and people acknowledge, they recognize the reality of the UFO phenomenon. And with it, of course, goes also the possible reality of entities that go along with the phenomenon. So people are aware that I think it's also because of what they see on YouTube or even in the newspapers. And in fact, the Vatican has declared that if ever that extraterrestrials exist, then they're very much welcome to be baptized. So,
I remember when that came out. That created a little bit of a stir.
Very good point. That was a very good point, Edwin. Thank you for mentioning all of that. Wanted to ask you, what was the defining moment in your life that convinced you extraterrestrial civilizations might exist? What was the defining moment in your life that you feel that convinced you that there could be extraterrestrial civilizations out there?
Personally, I've never had any close encounter for that matter. But the idea of humans as being the only intelligent, supposedly intelligent creatures in the galaxy or in the universe is probably doesn't really sit well with my idea of I mean, always believe that we are not alone. That's my own personal belief, for that matter. So it didn't have to have a defining moment, as you said, for me to embrace that kind of belief.
Great. Okay. And then I have another question for you, and I'm going to give you some examples regarding my question. I was going to ask you, could you please share a list of UFO cases that influenced you regarding the most evidence of possible extraterrestrial presence or ET-related craft? An example list of that might be Battle of Los Angeles in 1942, Roswell in 1947, Washington, D.C. in 1952, Socorro in 1964, Travis Walton in 1975, the Phoenix Lights in 1997. Are there any iconic cases like Betty and Barney Hill? Any cases like that that you believe might have been genuine?
I am particularly intrigued by the case of U.S. Air Force pilot Lawrence Coyne. I think it's a very
Yep.
iconic.
The Coin helicopter case. Yep, absolutely.
Yes, the Huey helicopter case, because when I was a reserve in the Philippine Air Force, I used to fly along with in Hueys, and that kind of interests me. And the coin incident is probably, of course, now one of the classic cases in ufology that really made me think that really there's something to it. As well as the testimony of Tarauchi, Japanese captain flying Jumbo 747 of Japan Airlines over Alaska, and I think that was also one because Japanese pilot like Tarauchi, they don't make stories. I mean, and
plus they had the radar backup on that case.
And they had the radar backup for that one. Incidentally, in the Philippines, because we don't have those that technology of or I've not seen one myself, and I've had one case involving an air traffic controller. His case was never known in mainstream media. I got hold of the story when there was some leakage and people started talking about it, in whispers. But when I got hold of it, and I knew that the witness was a good friend of mine, a well-respected air traffic controller at the airport where I live, and so I asked him, and I said, "Jin, I know you saw something, and in the interest of research, if I could, get to know the details." And that was when he opened up and told me about his experience. He's not a very he doesn't talk much, but he's a well-respected airport controller, and so he was a friend of mine because I would frequent the airport area myself. And I'm a friend of some of these guys. He had a very unusual.
What did he see?
Well, he said it was about early afternoon. It was a sunny day. He was at the control tower where he would, where they would watch for the planes coming in to land and take off. And he said he was amazed to see a bright thing going down, which at first he thought was a bright meteor. But he said it was too slow for a meteor. And so he said the second thing that came to his mind was it must probably be an aircraft in distress, but they didn't get no distress calls or anything, and that was the airport tower. But what amazed him was that the thing coming down all of a sudden stopped in mid-flight. It stopped in mid-flight and split into two, and went flying around, and that was to him something that was probably for the first time in his life he's seen that kind of thing.
Sure. Oh, no. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the Japan Airlines Flight 1628 was a UFO incident that occurred in November 17th in 1986 and involved a Japanese Boeing cargo aircraft. And that aircraft was en route from Paris to Narita International Airport near Tokyo and with a cargo of wine. And at some point on that flight, the crew first witnessed two unidentified objects to their left. These abruptly rose from below and closed in to escort their aircraft. Each had two rectangular arrays of what appeared to be glowing nozzles or thrusters through their bodies remained obscured by, though their bodies remained obscured by darkness. And then it says, when closest, the aircraft's cabin was lit up and the captain could feel their heat on his face. These two craft departed before a third, much larger disc-shaped object started trailing them. Anyway, Edwin, I was going to ask you, did you ever have any triangle-related sightings at all reported to you?
By triangle, what do you exactly mean by that?
Well, you know, the three-sided. We get quite a few of those kind of sightings here in the States, and also apparently that's what was cited during the Belgian uptick back in the late '80s. If you're familiar with that.
Oh, okay. Yep. All right. You're talking about the shape of the object.
Yes.
No, I have not come across any case regarding triangles.
Okay.
Okay, great. And then I was going to also ask you, what did you think about the Travis Walton case? Did you ever get a chance to kind of go over that case at all?
Yes, it's the one that they made a movie of.
Yes,
Yep.
Fire in the Sky, yeah.
Fire in the Sky, yes. I met Travis Walton himself during the 2016 International UFO Conference held in Scottsdale, and I did ask him that thing, and he seems to be a very shy guy, and he said he just told the truth, and that was it, and there's nothing more or less about it. He said what he actually disclosed was just the truth. There was all to it. He was taken on board. Yes, I believe him. I believed him.
Great. Yeah, I had a chance to interview him myself this year at the Phoenix Lights show that Dr. Gatia had in Scottsdale, Arizona. Was going to ask you, how did you? What is your perspective on the alleged Roswell craft that crashed? Actually, it was in Corona, New Mexico in 1947. What was your take on that?
Well, I read about it, and I think that was the case where they buried the entity in an unmarked grave somewhere there. I think that was it. I believe that there was something that went down at Roswell. Yes, I have no doubt in my mind. The late Stan Friedman, I think, did a very good research on that one too. And based on the testimonies of witnesses, either living or dead, appear to be very authentic. I don't have any doubt in my mind about the reality of the incident.
Okay. Then I was going to ask you kind of a complex question that I know that you can answer quite easily, I believe, and that is, do you believe the scientific and journalistic communities are purposely ignoring the possibility of the presence of terrestrial civilizations? If so, why? I'm going to go ahead and relay that question to you again. Do you believe the scientific and or the journalistic communities, mainstream media or the science communities, are purposely ignoring the possibility of the presence or existence of ET civilizations? If so, why?
My take on that, from a personal opinion, is that from the perspective of the scientific community, I think the reason for ignoring that is it's not exactly ignoring, I would say, but I believe that they know about it. They feel it's real, except for the fact that science needs hard evidence. You need empirical evidence for that matter, and speculating on some fantasy might not sit well with the academic aspect of science. So I believe that's the reason why they ignore it. But I probably from a personal point of view, I think somehow they probably acknowledge the fact that we are not really alone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I won't say who they are, but I know a few scientists who, behind the scenes, have told me they do believe that ET civilizations actually are not only present here on this planet, but are visiting frequently, and that they also visit by going down into the ocean. That there's spaces down there. They believe it's a possibility. But they would never, ever say that publicly. And then I also know folks who are involved in journalism, and they do believe that there's an existence of ET civilizations out there, but they don't dare write about it. So I was going to ask you, why do you think that mainstream media is ignoring the possibility of ET civilizations visiting our planet?
Well, some writers do write about them, but in a very sketchy manner. It's not exactly in depth, or it's because probably it might not really sell for that matter. Because journalistic writing, we have to accept the fact that it's a business. I mean, so. Or there could be some kind of restrictions that we don't know about.
Right.
I think,
Yeah. And
back to my mind, it's something like it's not exactly saying like they're having a gag order or something like that, but they're just probably pretty cautious about writing those things.
real quick.
Just what I think about it.
Yeah, let me jump in here real quick, Edwin. With the Philippines being islands and all, have you ever gotten any cases of UFOs coming out of the water or going into the water, into the ocean, anything? Yeah, USOs, unidentified submerged objects. Have you ever gotten any cases like that over there?
Not to date. None that I know of to date. But I came across a documentary which involves Russian submarines hearing some strange sounds from USOs. And the phenomenon, they did a research on that actually, and the phenomenon is said to stretch out even to the Philippines, in the waters of the Philippines. But any witnesses saying that they've seen USOs coming out of the ocean, none that I know of to date.
Okay.
As of today.
Just curious. That was for my old friend Chris. He was asking about UFOs. I figured, hey, you live on a chain of islands there, so maybe you did.
You're surrounded by the ocean. Yeah, and so then I wanted to ask you about disclosure. There was an article that came out a few years ago. I think it was called something like Glowing Auras and Black Money. I think it was Leslie Kean and Helen Blumenthal, and I think maybe Chris Mellon, right, Frank, that wrote that article?
Yeah, Mellon wasn't involved. It was Blumenthal, Leslie Kean, and a lady named Helene Cooper.
Yeah, that's right. It was those three. Thank you. I think they quoted Chris Mellon in that article.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, they sure did. That's an understatement. Anyway, I was going to ask you, when that article came out about Tic Tac that happened regarding folks who witnessed a Tic Tac like object